So, good morning, everybody. I'm Sarwar Kashmeri, moderating this panel on U.S.-China relations at this year's World Leadership Forum. We were to have Mr. Marc Chandler also on this panel, but we decided that we would have him on the first panel, and then he would join us during the question and answer session. Yeah? So thank you for that, Marc. Excuse me. So this is the Foreign Policy Association's flagship event, and it's been held for, almost 23 years. And you know, Noel, I remember that we held this panel even the year of 9/11. I remember sitting in Noel's office talking about whether we should still have this World Leadership Forum because it was just a few days after 9/11. And we were talking about all the destruction in New York and whether people would come. And I remember going back to my office on Madison Avenue and received a call from John Engler, who was then the governor of Michigan and one of the panelists at the World Leadership Forum. And I picked up the phone, and I'll never forget what he said. He said, "Sarwar, are you going to have this panel? Are you going to have the World Leadership Conference?" And I said, "Well, Governor, we've just been talking about it in the President's office." And he said, "Don't you dare cancel it. Don't you dare cancel it," he said. "New York needs it. The country needs it. I have my plane ready to come, and you just move ahead with the conference." And I just thought about that note to add a little bit of history to the Foreign Policy Association's World Leadership Forum. We held the conference. It was a two-day, actually, World Leadership conference. And I can tell you, there were very few dry eyes when we paid tribute to everyone at the opening of this. So just a side note here. And then on to the discussion today on...
Let me just interject that President Clinton insisted that we proceed with it.
President Clinton. Yes, he was. Thank you for that. And it meant so much. Everybody I talked to from Wall Street and elsewhere just talked about that was the first conference after 9/11 that brought people together. So now on our discussion today, because you haven't paid this heavy ticket to hear me, but I want to just say that on the discussion today on the state of the U.S.-China relationship, especially the business and financial part of it. So it's no secret that the two largest, richest, most technologically advanced countries in the world are at daggers drawn. If there's any silver lining, it is that the business community on both sides continues best they can to try and grow the already deep, broad relationship. Former U.S. Ambassador to China, Max Baucus, said at a recent Forbes conference, "Business, commercial, and personal relationships really help." And he said, because if there were no strong commercial relationships today between the U.S. and China, man, oh man, I just think at the geopolitical level, we'd be in a real hurting situation. So the role of business, the role of trade is a ballast that is keeping this relationship afloat. Now, there is a consensus, however, probably the only one, in Washington, across the political spectrum, reflected in the media, that China is the bad guy on the block and must be stopped. Media and people in China are beginning to respond to this, and matters just keep getting worse instead of getting better. Sooner or later, both sides, as Ambassador Baucus told Forbes, both countries need each other economically. We are joined at the hip. The danger is that by the time both countries realize it, the people in both countries will have been so turned off with the other that repairing the breach may become very difficult, perhaps even impossible. Meanwhile, in the US, the air is full of confusing and contradictory news. Example, China has run out of steam to grow and will now slide into an also-ran country. And then on the other side, China's economic problems are temporary and will soon pass. China's real estate loans and property companies are in dire straits. No way they can be bailed out. Look at all the bonds in default. And then on the other side, look at how one of the biggest real estate groups, Country Garden, was able to get its creditors to compromise on bond payments, and how well the yuan has responded. China's mammoth infrastructure project, the Belt and Road Initiative, is in trouble. That dream of Xi's is over. On the other side, the BRI is going to be tailored to meet today's environment, but keep moving ahead. No wonder the non-specialist but engaged person just doesn't know what to think. What do we do? That's the question that the FPA wanted to pose to this panel. Give us a perspective, give the engaged person a perspective to make sense of the most consequential relationship in the world, that between China and the US. And to help in this quest, we've brought together three of the most knowledgeable people in this business who I'd now like to introduce. So, on the extreme left, Mr. Shazad Kazi, firm-wide operations lead. Shehzad oversees product innovation, client services, new business acquisition, and corporate strategy at China Beige Book International. Since 2012, Shehzad has helped develop data collection for the China Beige Book platform and supervised the analytics team. He recently testified before Congress on the US-China relationship. During this time, he has also designed innovative services, product. He's a frequent guest on major national news networks, including CNBC, Bloomberg, CNN, speaks regularly at investor conferences. His articles have appeared in Barron's, Foreign Policy, and the Huffington Post, among other publications. He's not known for quibbling on words. Recent headlines from some of his talks and writing: don't buy into the idea of Lehman moment for China, or the China reopening, a tale of two stories. I'm going to introduce George Magnus next. He's coming to us from the UK on television, thanks to Zoom. George Magnus is an independent economist, commentator, and associate at the China Center at Oxford University, advisor to asset management companies. He has served as chief economist of UBS Bank. He's a regular contributor to the Financial Times, Prospect Magazine, other written media, and appears regularly on BBC TV and radio, Bloomberg TV, and other outlets. His best-selling book, Red Flags: Why Xi's China is in Jeopardy, is an eye-opener. He's widely acknowledged to have predicted that the 2008 U.S. prime mortgage crisis could well trigger a global recession, which, as you know, it did. He too is rather, how shall I say, careful when he talks about, when he writes headlines. Here's one: the days when business was business and politics was a nuisance are over. Here's another one: Beijing has announced new measures to support private companies. Its recent track record invites skepticism. Another false dawn for Mr. Xi. Last but not least, Dr. Zongyuan Zoe Liu. Dr. Liu is Maurice R. Greenberg Fellow for China Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. Her work focuses on international political economy, global financial markets, sovereign wealth funds, supply chains of critical minerals, development finance. She's the author of Can BRICS De-Dollarize the Global Financial System? And Sovereign Funds, How the Communist Party of China finances its global ambitions. She too is rather shy with her headlines. Xi's plan for China's economy is doomed to fail. Beijing needs to junk its economic playbook. So that's the panel. And the way we'll run it, and I'm sure we'll have, as the Germans call it, a lot of Sturm und Drang on this panel. But we have the first half hour devoted to giving opening statements by the panelists. Then we'll have an exchange between ourselves and by themselves. And then the final half hour we'd like to devote to questions from the audience. And if there is time left at the end, we let them make closing statements. So with that, let me turn over to Shazad Kazi first, and then Zoe, and then George. Hang in there. Then we'll have you. So the floor is yours, Shehzad.
Great. Thank you so much for inviting me and for that kind introduction. I also realize I'm the only one who doesn't have a book to his name, so and including Marc, to his name over there too. So good morning, everyone. Shazad Kazi, Managing Director of China Beige Book. Just a real quick background on China Beige Book, since some of you may not be familiar. So we're essentially the world's only large-scale data provider on the Chinese economy. And what I mean by that is that we're the only entity in the world that conducts large-scale, massive business surveys in China. I'm talking about thousands and thousands of companies every month, tens of thousands of companies every year. And we survey the Chinese economy across the board, every major sector of the economy, every part of the economy, regionally, geographically, state firms, private firms, large firms, SMEs, the whole thing. We were modeled essentially after the Federal Reserve and the regional Fed surveys. And we tried to duplicate that out in China as a private entity. 13 years on, we're still going. Unfortunately, some of our competitors from the time have not made it. And we'll get into that and why that is, because that's very much part of the story of where China is today versus where it used to be. The way we discussed it, I think what I'll do is I'll save my remarks on any of the geopolitical stuff for the discussion and maybe kick off from some of the things that you were talking about, which is what is actually going on within the Chinese economy today, and then, what are some expectations for where this is going to go? Because one of the biggest problems is that there's always this pendulum that swings wildly from optimism to pessimism, from bullishness to bearishness. This happens very rapidly, and really forget about the average person on the street. I mean, people trading money, people making business decisions, people in China cannot tell truth apart from fiction just because of all the narrative that's out there, because of all the bad research and commentary, quite frankly, that you get out there, and fundamentally a lack of actual data and information that drives most of the views. So let me tell you what we've been seeing specifically this year, and then we can broaden it out from there. And I'll try to keep this very, very short and to the point, and then we can really get into the meat of it during our Q&A and our other discussion among the panelists. So 2023 was this very important year. As soon as the COVID-0 Band-Aid was ripped off, a new idea emerged essentially late last year into January that the Chinese economy was going to immediately take off, that Chinese consumers were going to rush out of their homes that they had been locked up in, and they were going to start spending left and right. They were going to book tickets to Florence and Paris and everywhere else, and they were going to be buying Gucci and Prada up like there was no tomorrow. And there was going to be this massive amount of consumer spending. And of course, the government for almost 3 years hadn't been able to put into place any type of fiscal stimulus. So now was their chance. They were going to ramp up fiscal stimulus. So you would have these two massive drivers of growth in the economy. And by the way, all this was going to happen right away. And many in the market obviously believed that. And you saw what happened. Equity started taking off. The market started taking off. There was a big China rally. Our perspective, based on our numbers, and based, of course, on doing this for over a decade to our clients and whatever we put out in the public, was very clear. There was not going to be this immediate reactivation of the economy and this skyrocketing growth, either on the consumer side or on the fiscal side, starting from the first quarter. That's just not going to happen. It was unrealistic. And it was also unrealistic, not just because the data were showing that the ramp up was going to be very slow, and the data continued to show the ramp up was slow. We saw through the first quarter that there wasn't really that wave of consumer spending. Certainly there was no fiscal stimulus, et cetera. So the view ended up being correct very quickly. But we went back and questioned some of the assumptions behind that. There was people were ignoring the fact that all this mountain of savings that you're, for example, seeing in China, that the savings were accumulating at the very top. It was the wealthiest households that were saving. And they were saving not so they could go and spend their money on luxury brands. They were saving because this was money that was ultimately meant for investment. This is for wealth building. And keep in mind, by the way, that in the last 2 years or so, household wealth in China had been massively destroyed because of what happened to the property market. And property was no longer that area of attraction for investment that it used to be. So there was a complete sort of miscalculation just at the very basic, from the basic approach, the assumptions. Of course, the other one was that America, the United States, was being used as this analogy for gauging that revenge spending, as everybody calls it. No attention to the fact that here we had massive amounts of household stimulus. Forget the other big fiscal stimulus that came as part of that and all the other things that went on. You have no such stimulus household transfers that have taken place in China whatsoever. So these were some of the constraints which very clearly suggested that you were not going to have the economy ripping from day one, skyrocketing from day one. What we did say was that if there is going to be a consumer revival in China, and the comeback, you should start to see it pick up from the second quarter, and from the summer period onward, you should actually see the consumers move into motion, but still do not bet on big stimulus from China. And I'll come to that second point later. What has happened now, over the course of the summer, you've had consumer spending actually improve in China. It's nowhere near levels across the board, at least, where people expected travel, hospitality, and such have actually been doing quite well, pre-pandemic levels even. But things are starting to get better. The manufacturing sector in China has actually held up a lot better than anybody expected, including myself. But because that initial rally never took place, the sentiment on China, starting from about March and then, onwards into May and June, became incredibly depressed. And the irony is that when the data finally started looking up and showing that the recovery was slowly taking shape, at least the mainstream narrative on China was doom and gloom. And and there was massive amounts of sell-off, of course, that has taken place in the markets. And then you get to August, and of course, so the property crisis continues to worsen, and you start hearing the stories of, China is going to collapse, there's going to be a Lehman moment in China, and all sort of the doomsday scenarios were. Can you guys still hear me? Okay, yeah. And too loud? Oh, almost too loud, sorry. How about this? Is this all right? Perfect. And you get to the doomsday scenario, which is equally unrealistic, equally fanciful, and inaccurate, just the way the upside scenario of China's skyrocketing growth scenario was. Right? There has to be a realization of the fact, first of all, that you don't get a Lehman moment in a place like China. It is not a commercial financial system. The banks are government-owned. Institutions are forced to lend when the government tells them to lend. There has been a consistent history of recycling, whether it's good or bad, whether it puts a cap on China's growth, whether it creates moral hazard, putting all that aside, the fact is there has been a consistent recycling of bad debt within the economy. So, the idea that you're going to have this sudden collapse of China is just about as unrealistic as the idea was, as I said, at the beginning of China taking off. So the economic picture where we are today, counter to what you're reading in the headlines, or you have been reading in the headlines for the last 6 weeks, couple of months, conditions are actually better by comparison. That said, how do we think about this? Okay, so it's wrong at the beginning, wrong now, so what's really going on? A few things broadly to keep in mind. Number one, I am not trying to argue that somehow China is set to grow at the high levels that we're used to thinking about China growing at. Quite the contrary, actually. The era of big growth numbers coming out of China, double digits has been over for a long time, but I'm talking about 6 to 8%, it's over. The growth that you're going to get in China moving forward is going to be sub 5%. If things actually get better, property is a big question mark, a lot of problems going on within that sector. But if, of course, you continue to see the destruction in the property market, consumer sentiment doesn't really ever recover, back or remain subdued. You see an unemployment picture getting more and more out of control. And of course, you get to see the manufacturing sector not really being able to be the driver of growth that it was. You factor all these things in, you could be looking at a China that's growing at maybe 2%. If things get really bad, you could be looking at a China that's growing at 1%, looking out in the next 5 years or so. The point I'm trying to bring home is that the idea that you're going to get a big growing China continuing onwards, that's not happening at all. I think that's out. And the big reason, and I think maybe I'll stop here. I haven't kept track of how long I've been going. The big point to understand is the economic playbook in China has changed drastically. The party, Chinese policymakers are no longer looking for those big growth numbers. They're no longer looking for that investment-led growth, the highways to nowhere, the big boom in property, the investment-led model, which resulted in very high levels of debt within the economy and came at a very severe cost. They're very interested now in actually addressing the debt problem, in deleveraging. They don't want property to ever go back to being the type of sector it was. They deflated the bubble at a time and place of their own choosing. They chose to do this. It didn't happen by itself. So factoring in all of that, keeping that in mind, the economy that the Chinese policymakers want to see, of course, is one that grows at a low but sustainable, healthy pace, that is driven by household consumption, and it's not investment driven and not these high levels of debt. That's where they want to get. Whether they get there or not is a whole different question. That's what we're going to be gauging now to see, can the Chinese economy actually transition? But it's very important to understand when we think about things like big stimulus and the Chinese government stepping in to save the day, they're not looking to just have one crisis after another. Averting collapse is a different story. But they're no longer looking to juice growth the way they did in the post-global financial crisis era, and that model and those assumptions just no longer work for the Chinese economy. So it's a whole new, world out there. We're not familiar with what this next decade should or would look like. But the thing to again understand is our assumptions for the last 10 plus years or so really don't work anymore, and then it's time to start looking at data, facts, and figuring out the situation, as it's evolving, rather than just kind of saying, oh, no, the government's going to step in, we're going to get a big stimulus, and everything's going to be all right, or China's going to go back to being, 8 to 10% growth or 6-7% growth. That's not going to happen. Maybe let me stop there, and then we can pick back up on the ideas.
Sure.
Thanks.
Almost sounds like China exceptionalism. Huh? Zoe, let's turn it over to you.
Sure. Thank you, Sarwar, for inviting me. It's truly a great honor and pleasure to be here among the best and brightest. And I also know that if I have you have questions that I cannot answer, I have a full room full of expertise that I can pound my question to. You just heard from the man you always see on CNBC or Bloomberg. He give you a story about why our assumptions no longer work. And I'm going to calm you down a little bit by saying that actually there are some continuities. And I'm going to explain from a bigger picture perspective the idea that there are 4 Ds. I characterize the Chinese economic issue from 4 Ds: debt, demand, demographics, and decoupling, or the new term would be de-risking. And I'll explain to you why these 4 Ds matter for the Chinese economy. And I've been saying this since last year, and then when I first explained it to people say, no, Zoe, you are wrong, exactly as you were saying. Market expectations for China is, China is going to come roaring back. And unfortunately, the Chinese economy has not delivered that expectation yet. Therefore, you exaggerate the sentiment. This is the heightened disappointment. And I'm going to end by explaining to you why the Chinese economy has not peaked yet. And by doing a simple numbers game. So let me start with the 4 Ds. The first D is debt. And I would argue that a debt on itself is not a problem. Because Finance 101, you just leverage the hell out of your balance sheet, and that is finance. But the problem with China's debt is that its growth, economic real growth, is slower than debt growth. And the cost to finance additional debt becomes higher. In other words, additional stimulate is not necessarily going to come not just because of local government financing vehicles that they are really trying to address, it's also because the credit intensity to generate the same amount of GDP growth compared with 2008 is going to be tremendously higher. That is not just a problem for local government, it's also a problem for household. Again, it's not an issue of debt growth. It's the entirety of the Chinese household balance sheet deterioration. Over the past 15 years, numbers can show Chinese household asset has decreased, whereas their debt has skyrocketed. And more than 70% of the Chinese household debt reside within the mortgage market. And just to give you an example, before I came here, I was just trying to compare how much housing is the relative housing price between Shanghai and New York. Unsurprisingly, price to income ratio in New York is about 9 times, whereas in Shanghai, it's close to 50 times. And it's not just the household asset deteriorated because of the reason you mentioned. Unfortunately, real income growth at the individual household level also slowed down. And during President Xi Jinping's second term, it was even worse than the first term. So that. The second issue is demand. Last year in December, the Chinese government first, and as well as the party, put out for the very first time in the history of the Chinese economic planners' history, saying that they are going to promote domestic demand, and specifically they are emphasizing household consumption. For the first time in a written government document, they put household consumption ahead of state-led effective investment. That is a very welcome sign. And if that were really to happen, it could potentially also address the trade deficit issue, which is a very complicated political issue now between US-China relations. However, it seems that the government is very much leaning towards swinging back to the old growth model. And the reason I think the Chinese government is not necessarily going to stimulate the household is both economic and political. You give the economic reason, I give you the political reason. Empowering the private sector, empowering individuals, it simply means you are no longer going to place the party as well as the government at the center of credit and capital and resource allocation. So that becomes a political problem rather than the economic problem. The moment that the party realizes the implications, it probably would not necessarily do that. And you see this in the property market. I'm less pessimistic than many people with regard to the housing market. I will share your view. This is not China's Lehman moment, and I'll explain why. It's not China's Lehman moment because if you look at the top 10 developers, the 2 are already gone, Country Garden and Evergrande, and the latest one is Sonic. The latest number 1 is Poly Group. Poly Group developers is the property development arm of the Poly Industrial Group, which is China's leading weapon maker. So, in other words, what we are observing in the property market right now is those state-owned property developers, they are getting lower cost of finance. Some of their cost of financing is as low as barely 3%, whereas Evergrande or Sonical or Country Garden, they could be as high as 5% or 6% cost. Now, when you have the banks lower, the PBOC can lower the required reserve ratio, and you can squeeze the banks, making the banks relatively less inclined to lend out to troubled property developers. You squeeze them out, but continued confidence as well as support is going to be given to the state-led property developers. So on top of that, obviously crisis in the private property developers are not necessarily going to support consumer or household home buyers confident in them. Therefore, you would get all this demand going into state-led developers. So that's demand not coming from household aspect. And with regard to demographics, I think the problem with the demographic or shrinking population is that it's not demographic on its own is not necessarily a problem, but the problem becomes when you don't necessarily have the right policies to address it. Unemployment is obviously not a good thing, but I think China's population growth to slow down is not just chipping away China's comparative advantage in high educated, young, and relatively low cost labor. The problem also comes down to the additional cost on the social welfare system. China has a huge pension problem. The same, any country, perhaps here in the United States, we are also facing the same problem. But the problem with China's pension problem is that they really have just started to develop their own individual Chinese version of Roth individual investment. And on top of that, the bigger problem is regional inequality. The idea that certain provinces, like in Shanghai or Guangdong, the richer provinces don't really have a huge amount of pension problem or pension deficit problem, but in China's Rust Belt they do. So you now have exaggerated problem in terms of regional unequal development. That is another rationale for the government to address relatively slower growth but higher quality, which should be welcomed, but it's a different issue whether the government can solve this central-local power distribution problem. And then finally, in terms of decoupling, I don't think President Xi Jinping should be blamed for the previous 3 structural issues. He cannot be blamed for that because that is baked into Chinese economic growth model, financial repression. But his policy uncertainties has exacerbated the trend of decoupling in the sense that even without him, sure, multinationals would move out of part of the supply chain out of China to lower cost area for clothing, for toys, for umbrellas, as China climb up the supply chain. But his policy uncertainties really exacerbated it. COVID really exacerbated. And the narrative about a possible militarized takeover of Taiwan also further exacerbated. Therefore, you have this run on confidence coming from policy uncertainty. This is not good for China from the Chinese corporate side. This is not good from international business perspective. Now, let me stop by close down the 4Ds, debt, demographics, demand, and decoupling. And I want to remind us, going back to history, the idea that the Chinese economic growth, when Deng Xiaoping kicked it off, Deng Xiaoping on his flight back from the United States to China, he said, reform and open up really means reform and open up first and foremost to the United States. If China is not opening up to the United States, opening up to any other country would be meaningless. And perhaps this trajectory under Xi Jinping's leadership has gradually changed. Now, Professor Susan Shirk has a very good book documented actually a lot of these policies has started from Hu Jintao era, but Xi Jinping made it worse. So in other words, in order for the Chinese economy to start, I think China really need to gain the imported animal spirit, the idea that coming from Western or developed the foreign direct investment coming into China, the underlying of the talent, of the technology, of the capital is Western confidence in the Chinese economy, and it's a positive feedback, whereas now it's losing. Now let me explain why China has not peaked yet. As long as foreign direct investment can continue go back to China, as long as foreign imported animal spirit can regain, the Chinese economy can still grow. And the reason why the Chinese economy can continue to grow is also a numbers game. The Chinese population is about 4 times of the United States. And in other words, in order for the Chinese economy to reach the same level as the United States, you only need China's per capita GDP about one fourth of that of the United States. Right now, China is about 16%. So from that yes, about 16%. The United States is about 72,000, whereas China is about 12,000. So from that perspective, were China to grow to the one-fourth of the US level, that simply means by per capita GDP level, China only needed to reach to that level of Greece or Portugal. Trust me, I just checked the numbers. If China were to reach per capita GDP growth level of Greece, the Chinese GDP at the aggregate level would be bigger than the United States. Now, putting numbers apart, whether the policy tools can deliver that is a completely different issue. The Chinese, there is this recent Credit Suisse report saying that, well, by 2026, China is going to have have more than 12 million millionaires. And the growth compared with the number in 2020, that is about almost doubling. And in other words, if you look at how fast the United States is creating millionaires, China creates about 7 times faster in terms of millionaires. In other words, whether the continue the challenge to China is how to address this inequality problem at central local level, at individual level. Now, whether the government can have the policy tools to address that in order to lift up the bottom billion people. That, as long as the government can do that, the Chinese economy still has hope.
Well, thank you for that. I have a lot of questions, but I'm going to hold them. And George Magnus, I wanted to save you for last, just so you'd have everything in your quiver. So now you'll need to tell us about your book. China is in danger of collapse. And so over to you, George.
Thank you, Sarwar. I'm not going to give you a synopsis of the book, spoil the reading of it. But it's called Red Flags, and it really is about a lot of the things that you've heard about already from Zoe and from Shehzad. But I'm actually not going to talk about sort of hypothetical economics. I want to talk a little bit more about political economy, because we're talking about a relationship between two major powers. And I was actually curious as to how I was going to start my comments, really. But you made yourself, Sarwar, an eloquent pitch that business people on both sides of the divide in the United States and China should, I think you used the words, work their magic, if I read your 2022 piece correctly, to construct an environment of cooperation and rapprochement, which politicians have seemingly been unable to sort out. And that's the essence of the title of your paper, and obviously of the panel today, which is The Business of America and China is Business. And so, and you framed this argument by making the case that the United States could not stop China from becoming and remaining a superpower, and neither could China stop the United States. And I thought about this actually, because in theory, if that premise is correct, then there's a true balance of power between the United States and China, where both sides acknowledge, respect, and do not intend to fracture the sort of equilibrium in their relationship, there are certainly grounds for believing that some sort of mutual re-engagement is possible commercially, and perhaps beyond that as well. So I kind of get the point that you were trying to make, and that other people stand by. Unfortunately, from my point of view, I think the premise is not correct. And indeed, we have it on pretty good authority from none other than Xi Jinping himself, that China does want to stop the United States from being a great power. and has every intention of reframing the global governance system of values and behavior that govern the interaction of nations to make a more China-centric world by 2049, which is the centenary of the founding of the People's Republic. So we know this is true because just last week, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs released a very, very wordy, but also very interesting document in which it laid out the rationale and the details of the three initiatives that Xi Jinping has already announced, which is Global Development Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Civilization Initiative, but added two other kind of concepts, which is initiatives for the new frontiers of science and technology, and an initiative for the United Nations and its 15 agencies. I don't normally recommend people to read things that are really quite difficult to read. It's not very penetrable, but I think it's a really, really important document if you want to understand what China is up to in the global system and what its ambition is. Now, since he came to power in 2012, and especially since the 19th Party Congress in 2017, I think Xi Jinping's pursuit of modernity, power, and global status, can only be described as purposeful and strategic. And it's embedded, of course, in the concept that he has spoken about, which is the Chinese dream of national rejuvenation. In a nutshell, the Communist Party does not intend, in my view, to share global power or collaborate with true capitalists, if that's what we can call ourselves, but to transform China into a powerful, respected, and socialist country that has primacy in the global system and is a role model for emerging markets and developing countries, otherwise known as nowadays as the Global South. Now, if you look at it from this light, the business of America and other countries, I think, is to strike the right balance between caution and complacency in its China policy, and to be alert to rising levels of uncertainty and risk. And actual businesses, in other words, those businesses that actually do business in China or with China, I think should be aware, and you used my kind of quotation before, that the days when business was business and politics were an unfortunate nuisance, I think those days are over. The recently resigned president of the EU Chamber of Commerce in China said last year in one of his reports that ideology, and he's lived there for 30 years, he says that the ideology has trumped business and our members, quote unquote, need to run their businesses in that vein. And I think actually if you want to look at the views of the EU and the US Chambers of Commerce over the last 2 to 4 years as a sort of a timeline of corporate opinion, you get a very kind of revealing and illuminating picture about how the attitudes of foreign firms have evolved. So nowadays, about a quarter of foreign firms in China say they've already started or are anticipating diversifying their future investments into other countries, including in Asia, of course, like Vietnam and Cambodia, Malaysia, Indonesia, Korea, but also to places like Mexico. And actually, Chinese firms are doing this too. It's not just American and European and Japanese firms. In its latest report, which was out last week, the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai said that levels of optimism amongst its members in China were now at the lowest level since the surveys were started years and years ago. Only 17% of companies reported that their headquarters viewed China as their #1 foreign direct investment destination. And as a rising number of firms cut their investments in China, 70% of companies said that US-China tensions were to blame. 49% said that Chinese growth outlook was a material impact now. And 48% said that China's commercial and regulatory policies were making the business environment much more difficult for them. And I think, we shouldn't regard this as trivial. I think this kind of timeline of corporate opinion change is really important and significant for a couple of reasons, which I'll be very brief about. I know that we're running a bit short of introduction time. The first reason is companies really don't want to be in the crosshairs of legal and regulatory warfare. I mean, I use the phrase in a dramatic way, but I'm sure everybody knows what I mean. And also there's shareholder interest, of course, about conflicts of interest on ESG. So it's a very difficult operating environment for companies that they don't face in many other countries. The second reason is the deterioration in the business and governance climate, as China has not only turned the screws on its own decoupling. I mean, I don't think the Chinese see any difference between decoupling and de-risking, and neither should we. And also, of course, as the system in China has become more controlling and repressive. Some of this has to do with Xi Jinping, but as Zoe said, not all of it is his fault, right? The reason you're getting a more repressive China is because the development model the kind of deterioration set in over 10 or 12 years ago. Because that's faltering, it's forcing the CCP to become more repressive and controlling to keep the model intact as far as it can. So for all of these reasons, I think that the 2020s and, for the foreseeable future, I thought Shehzad could have commented about the near-term outlook very kind of competently, and I certainly agree. No collapse, no Lehman moment. The state controls all the liabilities in the banking system, can move them around at will. And we may even see, better numbers coming out in the second half of this year and early in 2024. But the medium-term, intermediate outlook, I think, is much different from which companies have been accustomed to, as Zoe also kind of argued. So I think, China's potential growth rate in the foreseeable future is no more than 2 or 3%, and there will be times when it might not even hit that for various reasons. One of the big issues China has is what I call the who will pay argument. The real estate bust, the aging issues, local governments, military and science goals. There just isn't. We laugh about this sometimes, that China has got money coming out of its ears, but actually local governments are bust pretty much in aggregate, and the central government has a small balance sheet by comparison, but won't take on the contingent liabilities. So for all these reasons, I think that businesses will carry on doing business in China. It's a big market, and everybody, still believes in that. But I think the environment for future investment in China is very, very different. And I think the environment for financial investors, who've had a pretty torrid time since China was admitted to the MSCI and other indices, trading opportunities are always there. But for long-term investment, security and value, I'm not sure.
Thank you, George. Thank you. We'll come back to you with some questions, I'm sure. But I was looking at the time, and I'm determined that we will give at least 20 minutes, if not more, for Q&A from all of you who've been kind enough to come here. But I want to, before I bring my good friend Marc Chandler into this conversation with perhaps a comment or two and then a question to start off the audience, I just wanted to, I was reading the New York Times last Sunday, and I was reminded at how closely connected the Chinese economy is to all of the Western economies. So there was a big article on Louis Vuitton Moet Hennessy, the world's largest luxury group. And it turns out, I didn't know this, Zoe, but Mr. Bernard Arnault was the richest man in the world until a week ago. Elon Musk was number 2. And then all of that turned around within a week, and Elon Musk became the richest man, and Bernard Arnault became the second richest person. Now, I must say, when I hear numbers like 180 billion, things kind of get all mixed up in my head. But the reason why all of this flipped over is because LVMH is the largest luxury group in the world. And the Chinese have slowed down their buying from Moet Chandon, from Chanel, from Dior, from all of that. And that was enough to flip these two guys from number one to number two. I just thought I'd throw out a bit of comic relief as we move on with this. And Marc, I would like you, if you are willing, to say a few words, join the conversation, and then start off the Q&A, and then I'll turn it over to the audience.
Sure. Well, thank you. Thanks a lot for that opportunity. And it's really a pleasure to hear such a erudite discussion of what's going on in China. I'm sort of like stuck in a way because I sort of think that there does seem to be a consensus and it's sort of swung right from China is astride the world. It's dominating the factories. It's going to be dominating the next technology, the EV, and then we got the pendulum that you cited that. Now we think that China can't do anything right. And I wonder two things. One, I guess, is really a question about Graham Allison from the Harvard School, I think, talked about the Thucydides crisis, or the challenge of the U.S. being a top dog country, and now we've got a rival. And I'm old enough to remember that we've had other rivals. When I began my career, it was Japan. And we had a U.S. congressman, I think, from Missouri, who took a sledgehammer to Japanese and South Korean cars because we didn't want to be importing so many of them, and their unfair practices and their subsidies and their Japan's MIDI industry that helped industrial planning. And I wonder if so. There's a Thucydides trap. Is this really what's going on here? And then I was wondering also the second part of that Thucydides crisis that Graham Allison didn't really talk about. That is that the U.S. is primarily a naval power. And the enemies the U.S. has had have been land-based powers, Soviet Union, Nazi Germany. And I wonder if maybe China, for various reasons, like the U.S. has something like 60 military bases surrounding China, that China becomes a land-based power. And so I guess my question really is, how do you think about the Thucydides trap? And then what about this rivalry? Is this something peculiar to China? So really, if China was a democracy, would we feel any better? Thank you.
Can't hear anything, sorry.
Said we'll start with Zoe, and we'll then go to George, and then come back to Shehzad, and somebody can tell me how to spell Thucydides.
Sure, Marc. That's I don't know how to follow up with that that very thoughtful comment. I really don't know how to follow up on that, but I will start from the second part in terms of naval power, and then work my way up there. So in terms, I would agree with you as well as. Agree with the Thucydides trap in from the analysis, the geographic or the geopolitics analysis in terms of land-based power versus naval-based power. But one footnote that I would want to put there is that yes, China does not dominate global sea land, is not the security provider for global commercial sea land, but China indeed has become the leading port builder and shape maker in the world. It's bigger than South Korea or Singapore. And the last time the United States built a massive ship at home, I don't even remember when. So from that, yes, you mentioned it correctly. China the United States has around about 60 naval bases near China, but China also has ownership, either through equity purchase or direct investment or buying the right to operate the ports around the world. China has more than 90 ownership in more than 90 ports in the world. And some of these are related to Belt and Road, some are not. And so from that perspective, I do think that China that perhaps, especially when the economic growth is slowing down. I'm not saying that the Chinese economy is slowing down. I'm saying that economic growth is slowing down, right? There's a difference between that. So if the economic growth is slowing down, and U.S. export controls, collective export controls by working with allies and partners, by restricting China's access to advanced technology. That probably is going to increase President Xi Jinping's ambition to achieve technology self-sufficiency. So in that scenario, perhaps he would have to make difficult choices to what extent he wanted to solve the economic problem, address household, or he wanted to beef up the PLA overseas. So in other words, I personally don't necessarily think that China is going to challenge the U.S. Navy because China already has commercial leverage. Just imagine it. If I'm a Costa Rica banana exporter and somehow my company is owned by I have major American shareholder on my company, and then because of maybe this company mislabeled Taiwan under country versus region, then this company could potentially be boycotted. And if this ship is supposed to be from Costa Rica to Greece, then, well, unfortunately, when your ship gets there, there's nobody at the port processing your paperwork. You don't even need to publicly exercise coercion. You just accept people were not there. Your paperwork won't get processed. And then your banana probably is going to get rotten very soon. So from that perspective, I really don't think, if I were Xi Jinping, again, I'm not, if I were him and I have resource constraints, that is probably like building up my navy around the world is not my top concern. And so, in other words, I agree with Thucydides' trap going back to the first part, but I think the United States emphasized asymmetric warfare and asymmetric capacity. I think that's very much China's strategy as well. So in a perfect world, when tragedies means we can, in the Greece sense, tragedies means you choose among all these good things and letting go one thing is a tragedy. Then perhaps from China's perspective, the choices are much more difficult. And in any event, I think China does want to avoid a war with the United States.
Shehzad?
Can't
You
hear
hear me?
anything.
Please go ahead.
Who, me?
Yes.
Ah, right. There's a lot of, Marc, I'm sure you know, there's a lot of controversy about Allison's thesis, and in fact, whether he got his history right in any case. And I don't actually see the inevitability of conflict between the US and China as, seen from a kind of a rather dispassionate point of view. I mean, there are no contiguous borders between the United States and China. There's obviously an issue, very serious issue about that the United States has had in its foreign policy for quite a long time, that nobody should be in total control of the Pacific. That it should be a balance there. But I actually think that the problem, if there is going to be a kind of a military problem, it would be an illogical issue. I mean, there is no logic that would actually tell you that the Communist Party would make a decision to become a pariah by threatening Taiwan militarily. But, strange things can happen. And one of them might be, in extremis, maybe arising from another point that you made that actually caught my attention, which I just wanted to make a brief comment on. You said, and I think with some cynicism in your voice, quite correctly, China can't do anything right. And I think that actually, while that may be the view of, some groups of, political people or groups anyway, it's not actually what most people think. I think most people recognize that China has accomplished incredible things in science and technology. We've spoken about electric vehicles and batteries and solar, wind, etc., etc. And I think two things can be simultaneously true. One is China, like Japan 40 years ago, can be a top dog in specific areas of science and engineering and technology. And it can also have a completely screwed up economic model. Both of these things can be true and are true. They can coexist. So when kind of, pessimists like me or skeptics, talk about why China has to go through a period of very, very difficult adjustment, it's not that it can't do anything right. It's just that in macroeconomic terms, it's got a serious problem, which politically Leninists are not really very good at addressing because it would undermine the raison d'etre for them being in power. Which brings me back to the whole issue about Thucydides, which is not that war is inevitable, but that economic weakness at home could prompt an intensification of nationalism, which is really unpredictable. We don't really know how these things will work out if illogic reasoning took hold.
Thank you, George. And Shehzad, a quick statement from you, and then we'll go to the audience. And if I may, I just wanted to make a quick point that the United States military, the Brookings Institution, have run a series of computer models. What would happen if war breaks out in the South China Sea? And in almost all of the models, the United States either draws or loses, right? Now, you can question computer models, but that's been the result in the Pentagon and in the Brookings Institution. And I just wanted to throw that out to add to your remarks.
Yeah, very
are they
quickly
better
to
than the
the.
economic models?
Sorry?
Are they better than the economic models?
Well, we'll soon find out.
Just very quickly, so Marc, I think great question, right? Because this is not the first time the United States is facing an economic competitor. Certainly, Japan, the big one, threats from Korea. One obvious difference, of course, is that. With Japan, we have a very different security relationship. They're essentially within our blanket. Korea, very similar, obviously increasingly so now, though it's a different picture. The security relationship with China is the complete opposite, right? Vis-a-vis China, if anything, there is the very real threat, as Zoe said, of there being a Chinese attack on Taiwan, which is a very big deal for lots of reasons, but also because it ties into one of the core needs of every economy of every person, everyday life, access to semiconductors. And Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Corporation being what its vital importance to, anything and everything you touch, from these microphones to your microwaves at home to whatever technology, means that protecting Taiwan has all of a sudden become a very, very critical thing for the US government and other Western economies to do. The other difference, I think, is that we have belatedly realized, policymakers, elected officials and such here, that we have essentially ceded access to critical supplies and goods to China. So whether it is critical minerals, whether it is other things like APIs, pharmaceutical ingredients, pharmaceutical equipment, et cetera, that the supply chain is so heavily within China that, of course, has all of a sudden become a massive risk to us, right? All we have to do is think back to last year, where the GE factory producing contrast dye shut down in Shanghai because of the zero COVID policy. And what happened? We literally couldn't have people having x-rays here and getting medical procedures done in the United States because there was a contrast dye shortage. Now, that's linked to a whole different problem of GE's monopoly on it, and we've got a whole antitrust issue in this country and trust issues that we need to deal with. Putting that aside, though, it means that rivalry with China is actually very heated, and so the entire context, I think, for the competition is very different than one we've had previously. That's how I would, I think, sketch out the answer.
Thank you. And let's go to the floor now. I know you've all got questions. There's one right there on the left.
China corporate sector could solve its leverage problem and restore growth by either massive write-offs of the debt or a conversion of debt to equity, or both. Are there groups in China that would support such a policy? And if so, what would they have to do to get that policy enacted?
So, Zoe, let's go to you, and then George, we'll come to you.
All right. I think that's an excellent question in terms of how to deal with the book problem. And I would think that there are three aspects of the question. One is the stock issue, the stock of the debt. And then in order to delever, to manage the debt, you would have to think about the flow. And then the third goes back to what George mentioned in terms of the cost, and in particular, who bears the cost, which is the nut of the essence of your question. Now, when we are, I guess, the question, I'm not exactly sure. I cannot address the entirety of the economy, but I'll focus on the local government debt problem. The local government financing vehicles, the local government-owned established companies that can help local government to raise shadow financing, build properties and all that. So I would say that it's not, there are serious economists in China saying that the central government need to bail them out. Basically massive debt write-off, as you mentioned, or do equity injection. And China does have an institution who did equity injection to bail out Chinese banks in the early 2000s. This institute called Central Huijin, and the way they did it at that time was to take part of China's foreign exchange reserve, establish this special financing vehicle, and use the Central Huijin to bail out the Chinese. Well, they don't call it a bailout; they call it recapitalization. To recapitalize all these Chinese banks that were, by international standard, would be insolvent because their non-performing loans was as higher than 25% at that time. So the model exists. Now, could they do another round of capital injection using foreign exchange reserve even to bail out, say, or have Central Huijin, because the model existed, have this institution to, say, recapitalize state-owned asset managers who manage all these bad debt problem? The idea has been floated. Even the Ministry of Finance made the case. However, when it comes down to local government financing vehicles or private sector companies, no. There is no political appetite there. There is not the reason is because once you started to bail out one, then you are going to have once you open the gate, everybody is going to line up. I need to be bailed out. Now it applies. This would not necessarily happen under President Xi Jinping, in particular, because in 2013, when he first took leadership, he wrote with his name on this paper. It's called Some Opinions on How to Deepen Structural Reforms. The NDRC had this document to say China is going to implement structural reform, and he has this personal note on it. And in the note, he specifically said it's very important to strengthen the dominant role of the state sector. And it turned out that he is an honest person. He has been doing exactly what he said.
Thank you. George, you have a quick addition? If not, I'll go to the audience again.
Very quickly, a couple of points to the questionnaire. I mean, the issue about financial restructuring and debt for equity would be much easier if this was not easier. It would be different if the debt problem was widely a private sector company problem, which it isn't. So most companies that are genuinely private in China are quite small and do not really figure very prominently in the debt metrics. The debt really is in state enterprises and in local governments, and of course in real estate developers. Bankruptcy, there is more of it nowadays than there used to be, say, 10 years ago, but it's still pretty sparse outside of a few private firms. Implicit guarantees from the governments or the state sector are occasionally, people think they're going to be kind of whittled away, but they're still pretty firmly embedded. And the kind of financial restructuring where you have, the kind of the cult of equity in China just isn't the same as it is like you're used to and like we're used to. And given where the debt resides, which is the public sector, it's very unlikely to happen, in my view.
Thank you, George. Back to the audience, please, in the front, and then we'll go to the back.
Thank you. To Zoe, your point about Xi Jinping's stated goal of moving to a more state-owned enterprise economy, There are so many examples of the implementation of that, with going after the heads of tech companies, virtually dismantling elements of the private economy in China. My question to you is, how far do you think he's going to take that? And what are the implications to American businesses seeking to do business in China as a result?
I can, and maybe you can also chime in here. Yeah, he would be the number person. Oh God, trying to read Xi Jinping's mind is like trying to read a Latin version of Bible, and I don't speak Latin, so trying to understand. So, but I do think that he has been doing exactly what what he said he's going to do, and to the extent that as Marc and George earlier mentioned, that if we follow this chain of thought, which is he is ideological driven, and he believed in not just ideology, but also the entire national rejuvenation, then the implication would be he has to reunite mainland with Taiwan. In order to do that, he would obviously realize that it is going to trigger sanctions, so he has to sanction-proof the Chinese economy to the extent that at least sanctioning China is at least equally painful for the sanctioners. So you have been saying that he's doing that, being altered financial system and all that, but it also necessitates that he probably would strengthen the dominance of the state sector, and on top of that, have people who he trusts to hold key positions. Now, I really do not know how to read, the sack of foreign minister and defense minister, to what extent people are angry at his personal pick. I cannot read that, but it's quite clear that if his goal is to rejuvenate the nation, then Taiwan is part of the plan. But I'm hoping that, given that he has another term, and given that he really have this good plan, but perhaps bad politics, good plan to prioritize Chinese household consumption, that means Chinese consumers could, if he could do that, that means additional Chinese household purchase from vacations, from services, from higher end goods, and all the other stuff. So that is good opportunity for American business, but especially in terms of good consumer sector. However, if the economy fails to grow, as George mentioned, perhaps the pressure for him to take over Taiwan as his legacy becomes higher. Again, it's contingent on economic growth. I guess that's my answer.
And then Bernard Arnault would become the richest man again, and Elon Musk would go ahead, Shehzad.
This is a great answer. I don't actually have much more to add, but I think one point I'll make now, in case we don't get questions on this, is that when we think about the intervention of the Communist Party within the market, one aspect of it is, of course, wanting to get greater control over the private markets. It's not just state-led, where you have state firms that are sort of the big champions, but also the Communist Party having people sitting on the boards of the major technology companies, for example. The reps of the Communist Party on the board having a say in the strategic decision-making and voting, et cetera, which means that the companies like Alibaba and the rest are no longer just there to make as much money as they possibly can and to make their shareholders rich. They now need to align their objectives with the objectives of the Communist Party and its objectives for the Chinese state. What does that mean? None of us in this room have any clue. So we're uncharted territory again, right? So that's one aspect to figure out. It's not, chances are, it's probably not very productive. The second aspect, as far as American businesses are concerned, and this is the larger conversation about, what does the economic and commercial relationship between the two countries, what does the future look like? We have to keep in mind that our views about China's national ambitions were wrong. the assumptions we made in the 90s were just flat out wrong. And if China wants to have big, strong competitors to American companies across, especially in the emerging technologies, not just, EVs, of course, are a big one. Elon Musk may not be very rich for very long with the way the Chinese EV companies are beating him in the market there. So we have to understand that there's very serious competition, and those days of fine, we'll transfer our technology and it'll be okay and we'll make money in the short run anyway. It doesn't work that way anymore. You want to transfer your technology, you're creating a competitor. We've learned this lesson in the last 20 years, but companies have to become really wise about how they think about China. As George keeps saying, politics is back. Politics is determining more or less everything now.
Thank you. Another question here.
This is a follow-up with technology. Anyone on the panel? So, 2 weeks ago, Xiaomi launched a cell phone that has 5G capability. Chip was built. Huawei, excuse me. It's Huawei. 5G capability built in-house by SMIC. And how does that impact the possibility of China invading Taiwan, when they bring these technologies in-house that were, previously thought incapable for China to produce? Does that embolden them to be more aggressive militarily?
Excellent question, and I must confess I've talked to a lot of people who are very surprised at the speed with which Huawei was able to develop this chip, which we didn't think they had the technology to do. Please, Shehzad, you want to take this one, and then George, I'll pass it to you.
Sure. Yeah, I think this kind of goes on to show us that a lot of times when we hear about things like export controls going into place, as we have, I think earlier this year it was, export controls are not nearly as stringent as they sound, right? So even though we have these export control restrictions vis-a-vis China as it comes, when it comes to the most advanced technology and the most advanced equipment, first of all, and this is still sort of a breaking news sort of a thing, people are trying to figure out the equipment that they utilize apparently is equipment that they should not have had access to under prior export controls, if I have this correct. But even, the fact is that the Commerce Department and the BIS, the Bureau of Industry Security, are giving out licenses through the back door all the time, right? Huawei, in the 4 years under Donald Trump that they were on the entity list, which people incorrectly assume to be the blacklist, it's not a blacklist, was still getting licenses from the U.S. government all the time, or the suppliers, rather, I should say, were. So this whole idea of being able to stop China and all that, first of all, it just requires a very different regime vis-a-vis the way we even think about and conduct export controls. It's very difficult. It requires taking a lot of allies, telling a lot of companies, you can't make money doing X, Y, and Z anymore because U.S. national security and perhaps your country's national security is at risk. But I think all that just shows us the massive loopholes and how incomplete and how inadequate these export controls are, even though, of course, the day they come out, the press will go bonkers telling you that, everybody's on a blacklist and blah, blah, blah. It's just not true.
George, do you have something very quick to add? And then I'm getting the hook from my friend Noel here, so we'll have to start winding up. And I would like to give all of you a couple of minutes to make closing statements. But do you have anything quickly to add to this?
A couple of thoughts. One is, obviously it shows that as Shehzad said, the export control regime is not as watertight as we might like to have thought it is or might be, and that China certainly does have the capacity to DIY, do it yourself, even if it's still a generation behind Taiwan and Korea and NVIDIA and so on and so forth. But the second thing is, and I just throw this out as a question, I don't really know what the answer is, but if it looks like China can kind of put a wall around itself, so to speak, and say, well, actually, we don't need your lithography machines, and we don't really need, we may not be state-of-the-art producers and manufacturers of chips, but we can get by with what we do. I wonder what American companies then will think about when they lobby for access to the Chinese market and lobby U.S. politicians and say we have to be there. They might just say, well, actually, we don't need to be there anyway, because the Chinese are doing it themselves. So Do you know, I think this could actually trigger a very, very significant change in US-China business relations, but I'm not quite sure what it looks like at the end of the day.
Thank you very much for that. And a minute or so closing remarks from each one. Zoe, may I start with you, and then Shehzad you, and we'll end with you, George.
Sure. Sarwar, thank you again for inviting me. It's truly a pleasure to be here and an honor. And I consider myself as a poster child of good U.S.-China relations. I grew up with people telling me going to America is a good thing that you should desire. And all that I wanted to say is to quote President Bush, perhaps, after Tiananmen, when he was handling Tiananmen, he said he does not want this moment to be the moment that we turn China inside. And I think while we are not at that moment yet, I do hope that we are not pushing China to turn inside. And I do hope that my friends, their children, their grandchildren, they still want to come to America. And I hope that American friends and their children and their grandchildren can still go to China.
Thank you.
I think I'll just repeat kind of what I said earlier, that it's incredibly important to understand China for China's own national ambitions, how the party describes what its goals are, what President Xi, et cetera, say, rather than our views of what it should be, et cetera, and move forward from there. And again, just the very critical thing, especially for businesses, that increasingly, as China is becoming more and more closed, it's becoming an information black hole, as I said in my congressional testimony, but that just makes it all the more vital to grab onto more and more data and concrete information as we think about China. We got to get the guesswork out, and we got to get the narratives out, because they've misled us.
Thank you. George?
Yeah, I mean, I hope for the best. I mean, we all hope that things can, some sort of levels of communication, collaboration, inter-exchange, and so on and so forth will persist. But I think the reality is that, the United States and other liberal-leaning democracies in China have locked horns in a struggle over values and beliefs. And I think that makes it pretty serious ideologically. And I think businesses, will face a very, very more fractious future. I mean, obviously, if you're selling luxury goods into China, it's not very contentious. But there are a lot of products and goods and services that are. And I think I fear that this will be, a fault line for the foreseeable future.
What an extraordinary panel. Thank you, George. Thank you, Zoe. Thank you, Shehzad. Thank you all for coming. FPA, a round of